you can then exercise political capital, or you can gain political capital in some way. And so the 5 types of capital here, and you can put human capital or other forms of capital. These, I've just chose to put these. I'll just run you through these quickly to show you what I mean. So here we can see that capital, economic capital of FIFA and IOC is ever increasing. But we have here the top sponsorship program, which are the biggest companies that don't actually contribute so much money. Coke, McDonald's, Dow Chemical, Hyundai, etc. They're not actually putting that much money, and those companies are multi-billion-dollar companies. FIFA has 350 employees and $5 billion in the bank. 100 American universities have more than that. I mean, each one of them, the endowments. The endowment of FIFA is actually quite small compared to even a small-size American university. And so how is it they get all this money, but they have to do it through the capture of the symbolic economy of the event? Right? So these brands pay money to be associated with the Olympic rings, as does this clown at the time. As do these guys. And so the symbolic capital, the economic potential of the event creates symbolic capital, which then creates political capital. Crimea, yes, thank you very much. And then we see the degree of association with the cultural capital. And so here, I took this picture over the summer. I was so thrilled to see Zurich in Rio, more or less. But they're, of course, capturing on the cultural and symbolic capital of the event, associating themselves with capoeira players on the shores of the Bahia de Guanabara. And so these kinds of capital all accumulate and then are exercised. The more capital you have, the more power you can exercise. I mean, it's clear. I hope it's clear. So with that, we go through power, and then we have, and the idea of power is, of course, more complicated, and I'll get to that later. But the exercise of power to transform circulations happens through actor networks, both global, translocal. And this is here where our group has been working quite diligently over the last 2 years, investigating the knowledge transfers and the actor networks of FIFA and the IOC, and the articulations that they have, and how they move, how they circulate these events around the globe through their interdigitated but temporary networks. Oh, sorry. Enough of that. These, no, sorry. All right. Don't want to make me throw up before the upload. So, after anything's fair. The circulation and accumulation comes through the public financing of big contracts that go into private profit, and then the intervention to stimulate these flows can happen through legal interventions. And this is just a very basic way of where we can move from accumulations through power into flows and circulations. That's not the core of my argument today. The core of my argument today is the way that these flows are generated. And so we have accumulation, power, flows, and circulations. The way flows are generated and transformed into circulations. And so we need to first deal with the flows. And so the goal, one of the goals, if the main goal is accumulation, the way to do that is by stimulating flows to the city. You stimulate money, you stimulate attention, you stimulate power, ideas, capital. Things need to flow through the city for the event to make you money, eventually. So once you have enough money and ideas and people and PR machines, you put together an actor network that forms a bid that presents a city in all its splendor. Los Angeles, come live in the sun. Paris, it's the most sophisticated. Rio, it's the sexiest, grooviest. And the way this happens is through a process that I call geoporn, which is the tactical deployment of landscape to stimulate quick, intense, emotional responses in a target audience. So in this case, you're my target audience. This is a picture I took from my second or third flat in Rio. Isn't Rio lovely? Doesn't this stimulate a lovely feeling in you? But for the IOC and FIFA, they want to stimulate other kinds of imaginaries. They want to stimulate an Olympic utopia. Look at this. It's an isolated, beautiful site where you can have high security, televisual glory, and you can circulate freely as the Olympics. So this is intended to stimulate effective emotional desire in the IOC members that will be voting on this proposal, a mobilization of a utopian landscape. That's not the only kind of flows you want to stimulate. You also want to get the tourists there. You want to get the lads from Denmark and Holland and Germany down there to see the World Cup or Carnival. And so you mobilize the landscape in a very different way. And this is beyond disgusting, but this is the official Rio de Janeiro city mascot for the 2012 Carnival celebrations. Joe Carioca. Obviously, Birkenstocks, high socks, stereotypical German. Well, for Brazilians, obviously. Right? I mean, it's true. Maybe not with those ears, but hey, whatever. But if we look closely to what's going on, we see that the women are embodied literally in the landscape. So here we have the Maracanã. Here we have the sugar loaf that I just showed you, and Cristo. And so by representing the landscape on women's bodies, you can say to this guy, who obviously has no clue about anything, that he can dominate the landscape more intimately than others. Geoporn. And what does geoporn want to stimulate? It wants to stimulate flows. Flows of images, of discourses, about development, about the idea of the Olympic city, about people, about populations. It wants to move new populations into the city, energy, capital, but then all these things also generate flows of resistance. Increasingly, when we've seen it in Boston, we saw it in Hamburg, we saw it in Oslo, we saw it in Graubünden 2 weeks ago, we're seeing it now in Paris, that the resistance to these flows also increases the more you try to bring them to your city. But in the case of Rio, this didn't happen soon enough. And so we have flows, massive amounts of flows, people, capital, information, etc., coming to the city. But in order to turn those flows into accumulation, to exercise power, they need to be transformed into circulations. And this is sitting at the core of what a lot of social scientists are looking at today relative to infrastructure. Infrastructure as the core of analyzing urban political economy. And so by looking at issues of governmentality, biopower, and of course the governance of circulations is at the core of Foucault's idea of the emergence of the urban. And so he calls it the milieu is the site of governmental interventions. And the milieu for Foucault is circulation, the space of circulation, where this happens. But of course, flows move, as they are moved through networks and moved through infrastructure, these infrastructures then impact back upon flows. And so if you build a highway, you are creating a circulatory mechanism that also generates flows in one direction or another to certain areas or other areas. And I'll show you how this happens. And so in order to capture images and discourses through the media, or to capture the images of the football match, to circulate those around the world, we need fiber optic cables. In order to move tourists, the flows of tourists through the city, you need to have tourist circuits, hotels, stadiums, all kinds of security systems, etc. In order to have the IOC move through, they have to have bodyguards, they have to have VIP escorts, etc. through security mechanisms. And so in order to capture the money, you have to pay with a Visa card to get into a World Cup match. And so that then circulates the flow of money into a certain accumulation regime. Okay, so these are the impacts of transformations. And finally, this is the last bit of the argument, moving into how these circulations are rendered. And so the idea here is that the extraordinary rendition of circulations is the mechanism. I'm telling you the end before the beginning, but it's the mechanism through which FIFA and IOC make their money. They capture their rents. And so a rendering, in this sense, can mean three things. One is to draw. Geoporn, you render the city. You create the Olympic imaginary. You draw it out. Architectural rendering, we all know this term. The second term I get from G.W. Bush, the extraordinary rendition of prisoners around the world. And so, but the extraordinary rendition is an act of surrender or handing over juridically across jurisdictions. The extraordinary rendition of targets in the CIA's program took them across jurisdictions extraordinarily. And then one of the most interesting things I found out is that to render comes from the Old English or the Old French rendere, which means to hand over rents to a feudal tenant or lord, in this case, through the host city contract, the HCC. So when you sign on the line, you're handing over your future rents to the feudal lord, which is FIFA or the IOC in this case. And I'll show you how this happens. And so in order to distinguish between types of rendering, I make this suggestion, which is by no way conclusive.